Welcome to Native America Calling. From Studio 49 in Albuquerque, I'm Harlan Nicasito. The holiday season is full of family gatherings that help define who we are as Native families and who we are as tribal nations. For many Native families, the modern-day family unit consists of people outside of our own tribal community, and even consists of people outside of the entire Native American race. What types of dynamics are exposed when home for the holidays includes bringing home a so-called outsider? Do you think twice before bringing someone home who's not familiar with our cultural ways? Join us as we take a view from an outsider right after National Native News.
Native Voice One, the Native American radio service.
This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez. The International Red Cross is responding to a cry for help from a First Nations community in Northern Ontario, a month after it declared a housing emergency. And as Dan Karpinchuk reports, Native leaders say this is only one of scores of Aboriginal communities across Canada that are disintegrating under the weight of poverty.
The appeal through the media was what finally galvanized a response to Attawapiscat's emergency, despite calls for help over the past couple of years. The housing shortage for the 2,000 residents is described as critical. 122 families living in buildings that have been condemned, 90 people living in an abandoned construction trailer, and 5 families facing a winter living in tents. In addition, there's a lack of clean, fresh water. John Saunders is with the Red Cross.
The circumstances in this particular community are dire, and do not exist in many parts of the province. And this is also why we've mobilized as quickly as we can in order to get assistance into the community.
A Red Cross team arrives today loaded with emergency supplies paid for by a sudden flurry of private donations and offers of help. But the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Sean Atleo, says Attawapiscat is only the most severe and most recent example of Canada's First Nations communities feeling the full weight of poverty.
I've been to many communities like this. In Northern Ontario, Northern Manitoba, Northern Saskatchewan, Northern Quebec. But we do have examples like this across the entire country. And so while we immediately moved to support Attawapiscat, it's important that at this moment in our history, we suggest this is no longer acceptable in Canada, a first world developed country, and we will not accept this.
Emergency measures officials from the Ontario government and a team from the federal government arrived in Attawapiscat on Monday to assess the situation. Meanwhile, the Federal Minister of Aboriginal Affairs says the government has provided tens of millions of dollars to Attawapiscat over the years. For National Native News, I'm Dan Karpinchuk.
The Oglala Sioux tribe in South Dakota is getting some major updates on its public safety facilities. The tribe has broken ground on several new projects and buildings. Charles Michael Ray reports.
Angela Prue is with the Oglala Sioux Tribe's Office of Public Safety. She says the upgrades include a new communications tower, new housing units in 5 districts, and a justice center with court facilities, a 911 call center, an attorney general's office, and law enforcement administration. Prue says the new facilities will improve the justice system on Pine Ridge.
Bringing all the different departments together for the justice center. When somebody gets arrested, they'll be going into the holding cell, and then from there they'll go right to courts, and they'll all be in the same building, so it'll make it a lot easier and more efficient.
The former police administrative offices were in an old brick building in the middle of Pine Ridge. The old building has major heating and infrastructure problems. The new Justice Center is located south of the town of Pine Ridge near the Nebraska border and is set to be completed by next year. For National Native News, I'm Charles Michael Ray in Rapid City, South Dakota.
The Cherokee Nation's tobacco prevention program reaches its 5,000th student. The Oklahoma tribe says it reached the milestone recently during a tobacco prevention presentation at a middle school. The program was started 4 years ago and has been presented to schools throughout the tribe's 14-county jurisdiction. It includes information on commercial tobacco and cancer. Inspirational and traditional Cherokee stories are also used to teach students. During this week in 2000, the voice of the Yakama Nation went on the air. KYNR is located in Toppenish, Washington. The native radio station airs national and local programming and broadcasts from powwows, round dances, and school sporting events. This is National Native News. I'm Antonia Gonzalez.
National Native News is produced at the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Kowanik Broadcast Corporation. with offices in Anchorage, Alaska. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the Annenberg Foundation, and the Ford Foundation.
If you are a Native American who was denied a farm loan or loan servicing from the USDA between 1981 and late 1999, you could get a payment of up to $50,000 or more from a $760 million settlement. Claims must be filed by December 27, 2011. Learn about getting free help filing a claim at IndianFarmClass.com or by calling 1-888-233-5506. Paid for by the Keeps Eagle Settlement Fund.
Native Voice One, the Native American radio service.
This is the Tuesday, November 29th edition of Native America Calling. I'm your host, Harlan Nakasato. Well, Native America, we made it through another holiday, Thanksgiving weekend. And for some of you, it was probably a lovely time of year, full of family ties that remind you about the treasure you have with those that are related to you. Now, for some of you, I know you're probably breathing a sigh of relief that you made it through. And perhaps you're excited to get back to work, to get back home, miles away from the family. But despite what side of the coin you lie on, it seems the holiday season often prompts us to define family and just who we are as modern-day Native families and tribal nations. For many Natives, the family unit consists of persons outside of the tribal community and even outside of the entire Native American race. So today we're kind of looking at what types of dynamics are exposed when home for the holidays includes bringing home a so-called outsider. All right? Who is considered an outsider to your family? I mean, just what is it like to introduce a new member to the family through marriage or a relationship? And everyone sort of looks and says, who's that? All right. Often we take the angle of viewing the outsider and what adding them to the stew means, and just how their simple inclusion affects us as Native people. And the conversation has seemed to end there. So today we want to hear from the outsider and what we as Native family members and perhaps the whole Native community challenged them to think or do. And taking a view from the outsider's place, what have you experienced? All right? What have you experienced entering a Native family? And what about when you take them home to your kin? All right, do the roles reverse? And what about the word outsider? I mean, how detrimental to a family unit is it to use this term that is so often attached to the partner or spouse? All right, how does this affect the children? What about when it comes to decisions parents have to make about sharing culture and heritage? And just how does the outsider fit into this paradigm? We invite you to join the discussion as we take a view from an outsider into our Native culture, okay? Phone lines are open. You can give us a call if you want to join in. The number is 1-800-99-NATIVE. That's 1-800-996-2848. Joining us right now from Ann Arbor, Michigan is Tiya Miles, and she is chair of the Department of Afro-American and African Studies and professor of history, American culture, and Native American studies at the University of Michigan. She is the author of 2 prize-winning books, Ties That Bind, the story of an Afro-Cherokee family in slavery and freedom, and The House on Diamond Hill, a Cherokee plantation story. And she's also written various articles on women's history and Black and Native interrelated experience. and she is a co-editor with Sharon Holland of Crossing Waters, Crossing Worlds, the African diaspora in Indian country. And in 2011, she was named a MacArthur Foundation Fellow. Welcome to Native America Calling, Tiya.
Thank you, Harlan.
It's great to have you with us. Also joining us right now from Ann Arbor, Michigan, is Joseph Gahn, and he's an associate professor in the Department of Psychology under the clinical area and a professor with the program in American culture under the Native American Studies at the University of Michigan there in Ann Arbor. As a cultural psychologist, Joe addresses his research to a key dilemma confronting mental health professionals who serve Native American communities, namely how to provide culturally appropriate helping services that avoid the neo-colonial subversion of indigenous thought and practice. And Joseph is Grovon from the Fort Belknap Reservation up in Montana. Welcome to Native America Calling. Welcome back, Joe.
Thanks. It's really great to be here.
It's good to have you with us. And, man, this is a big subject, and I'm glad we're taking this on. I'm glad you guys are here to help me with this because it's a big subject. Tiya, let me ask you this. Okay, you guys have been married, 13 years? Mm-hmm. Just celebrated your 13th anniversary. You have 3 children. You have 7-year-old twin daughters and a 3-year-old son. Is that right?
That's right.
All right, and they're now all enrolled as citizens of the Grovon Nation. Mm-hmm. Okay, but let me take you back. I don't know, 13, 14 years ago? What was going through your head when you were driving toward the house about to be introduced to Joseph's family?
Well, if you don't mind, Harlan, I have to take us back a little bit farther than that.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And say that I think that the way that Joe and I met was really kind of incredible, I mean, even kind of miraculous, because we were 2 people who should not have been where we were. I grew up in urban Ohio. I was a child of divorced parents and had a single mother through a lot of my childhood and ended up getting a scholarship to go to a private prep school in Massachusetts. And from there I ended up getting a scholarship to go to Harvard University, which is where I met Joe. So I shouldn't have ended up at Harvard, and in many ways he also had a winding pathway to get there. So a lot happened before we were driving that highway to Fort Belknap.
Oh, I imagine there was, but, so you guys meet, you fall in love, but, I mean, at some point, though, you had to be introduced, right?
Right.
And what was happening there?
Well, I think
butterflies.
There was a lot of work that was done before I ever went home with Joe. So my first experiences with even interacting with Native people started taking place on campus when I started going to meetings that he was attending and to lectures and presentations he was attending having to do with Native issues. And to me, this was a whole new world because when I was in college, I was all about Black issues. I was in the Black Student Union. I was co-editor of the Black Literary Magazine, and I was studying Black studies. So my whole framework for looking at oppression and experience was through African American experience. And meeting Joe just completely opened that up and showed me that there were a number of different issues that Native people experience that I had no idea about. So that was happening before we even went back to Fort Belknap, which was in 1992 after we graduated from college. And when we got there, I think that my first impression really had to do with the landscape. And I'm an urban, person. I'm used to tall buildings. Montana does not have a lot of tall buildings. It's gorgeous and open and mostly rural. And Fort Belknap is in a gorgeous prairie with the mountains. And I was stunned just by the landscape and a little bit intimidated by the landscape and how open it was. That was the first impression. And then going on to Fort Belknap, I was kind of surprised by the housing that I saw. It reminded me a lot of low-income housing that you would see in poor urban areas. It was HUD housing, really. And that was an eye-opener for me to think about kind of the class differences that might be there existing at Fort Belknap that were really different from my previous experience in college.
Okay, Joe, what was going on in your head as you and Tiya were headed toward Fort Belknap?
Yeah, it's funny because I don't actually remember the very first time that we drove there. I mean, we got together, as I said, in 91, so we're married 13 years, but we've been together really 20.
Mm-hmm.
And Tiya came out to live on the reservation following the summer after a year in college and lived with me there for, I guess it was 8 months, something like that. And, so part of it was like, what kind of job could she get out there? How will she keep busy? And, she ended up teaching at our tribal college for a term.
Wow.
And applying for a job before our tribal council, which she didn't get. But and meanwhile, I was just trying to find ways to keep working as well so that we could get ready for graduate school in the future. But my feeling was that Tiya being the kind of person she is, I knew that folks in my family would be very accepting of her because she's very gentle, very kind, very smart, very open, very creative, and I think able to think through and see differences in ways that are really accepting and engaging of them rather than being fearful or judgmental. And so I think the transition into our community wasn't as abrupt. I've never had anyone in my family that I can recall refer to her as an outsider, and I've never really thought of her that way.
Now, Joseph, do you think that, having a relationship with someone outside of our cultural ways do you think it's different for Native people? Because we do exist somewhat outside the margins in many ways. We're sort of a subculture of America, and did that ever? I know Tiya, just from hearing her speak just now, is everything that you just explained. But do you think that in general, thinking outside of your relationship, that there's possibly some difference when it comes to Native people, because we're not really inside the American dream, I guess.
Well, yeah, so I think that's true for many, many Native people, that we aren't partaking of the American dream to the degree that many would want, or having other opportunities to do something different to the way we would envision those ourselves. But I think that's what's kind of interesting about my story with Tiya, is that in some ways we are living the American dream. We've been on track to live the American dream for kind of a while. And so our coming together was an opportunity to take that, and as part of what we consider to be the American dream, to envision a new kind of America in which a person of African American ancestry and a person of Native American ancestry could be together in a loving relationship that's committed, and that would have children who would be both tribal members as well as African American, the descendants of slaves. And that's why I think our relationship is sort of interesting in this regard, because you can see through it, almost like a lens or a prism, the issues that affect America for so much of its history: race, class, and culture. Now, I think you're right that, of course, American Indians are culturally distinctive in many respects. So are African Americans in many respects. And so this relationship is one where it's sort of a pivot or a fulcrum as we try to make sense of a lot of different ways of living in the world, different value systems, different perspectives and worldviews, and how those resonate or meet or sometimes contradict, but in ways that has remained very exciting for us, and also sources of hope and inspiration as we think about how to raise our kids.
Tiya, when it comes to Native culture, do you feel like you're included in that part of the family discussion, or do you feel like sometimes maybe you're left out of that conversation?
I have always felt that I was accepted and included by Joe's family, and especially by the women in his family, who immediately when I went to Fort Belknap, I felt like they embraced me.
Wow.
And we stayed with his aunt during that year that Joe described, and I got a chance to sort of be pulled into the culture of women in the family and to experience what it was like, which was really different, for me, of having people just come into the house all the time, day and night, and coming in, getting some food, sitting down, visiting. This was really different for me, and I was just there, and I was a part of it. But I can say that I am sure there are things that I don't know about or things that I'm missing that I'm not even aware of. So even after all these years, and even after feeling so accepted and you're receiving so much love. And I just remember Joe's grandmother, making me a star quilt that first year I was there, that I cherished. Even though I've experienced a sense of being embraced, I know there are things I don't understand, and there are spaces I haven't participated in, and things that I just cannot experience because we only lived at Fort Belknap for a short time together. And visits do not encompass an experience. They don't encompass what life is like every day living in that community.
Mm-hmm. And that's so true. And what about the opposite side? What about when you took Joe home to meet your family, Tiya? What was that like?
Well, one thing that I think Joe and I have experienced is that even though our families were personally warm to both of us, that there were some points of disconnect or points of just, pure misinformation about the group that the other one came from. So, in Joe's family, I think that most of the people who had been black, who were around, were really only there, through media, through television. Mm-hmm. And in fact, there was one black nurse who used to work at IHS at Fort Belknap, and for the longest time, people thought I was that one black nurse because they just weren't used to having African American women, there. So there are those kinds of things of being kind of misidentified. And I even heard, through the grapevine of some people using the N-word, not about me, but about African Americans in general. And when I learned those things, I was hurt. And in my family, I think there was a similar lack of understanding about Native issues. So one thing that came up in my family right away was a lack of acceptance that Native people have their own history of colonization and oppression in this country, and that history could be as bad as or worse than African American experience. That those two experiences were both atrocious. My family members didn't quite understand that at first, and would even suggest that because Joe was lighter skinned than I am, that he would have the same privileges as any white person. And that was an issue that we had to kind of come back to in the early years, that Joe is not white. Being Native is not the same as being white. It's completely different.
Wow. Joe, what was that like to be seen or perceived as being white?
Well, it's interesting. I think it cuts two ways. Of course, Native people are not white and haven't enjoyed the privileges of whiteness in America in many, many respects. On the other hand, most Native people are lighter skinned than most African American people, and as a result, there's a skin privilege or hierarchy in America whereby, I think that some Native people get a pass based upon being lighter than Native people, and I think that when black people recognize that and want to therefore lump Native people and white people together on the basis of that skin privilege, there's some logic to it. I think early on in our relationship, I felt very accepted by Tiya's family, but I also, heard rumors. I think one of Tiya's relatives, referred to me sort of derisively as running bear for a little bit. There were worries that, maybe I would become an alcoholic or maybe I'd be violent to her at some point in our relationship, just on the basis of Native stereotypes. And there are members of my community and of my extended family who also had stereotypes about her that, we, or not about Tiya specifically, but about black people, that we had to, explain were not really grounded or founded and had to think in a different way. That's part of what this relationship means to us, is because race is here, because class is here, because culture is here. There are opportunities to try to sort through and work out, what in a microcosm of our relationship and our family are the prospects for an America that has dealt with these same issues at a societal level for a couple hundred years.
All right. You know what? Let me give out the phone number real quickly. We're talking about bringing in so-called outsiders into our tribal community. Some, people who aren't familiar with our cultural ways and just the way we live day to day. Let me ask you this: when you hooked up with someone who wasn't Indian, all right, did you get nervous that first time you were going to bring them home to meet the family and the relatives and to just kind of show them, your life, All right, what about this past Thanksgiving? What I'd really like to do is hear a story from someone who took home a non-Indian just this weekend, all right? or if you want to share the story about, when you took that person home, Hispanic, white, black, what was that like? All right. Let's light these phone lines up. Come on. 1-800-99-NATIVE. That's 1-800-996-2848. You got a story. I know I got some stories. I might share one. All right. Let's go to Kenneth, who's in Wayne, Oklahoma, listening on KCMP. You're on the air, Kenneth.
Hi, Harlan.
What's up?
Mine is a little bit twisted story.
Uh-oh.
I was adopted into a white family, and as I started digging into my birth family, I found out that my great-grandmother had been brought here on the Trail of Tears from Tennessee when they were, removed from the land there. And it seems like I'm caught in between two worlds. I can't seem to find that balance, that I'm not accepted on either side. If I try to say that, dig in to find my documentation in my past, it's people think I'm crazy, well, why do you want to do that?
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of hard, and not being accepted and being able, I don't know, it's difficult. And
well, you know what, Kenneth, I know, okay, in Oklahoma, things are a little different there because there's so much intermarriage between Native people and white people.
And that happened in my family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's after grandmother, and then the family being split the way it was, and brothers and sisters gone in different directions, and it's kind of hard to put the pieces back together once they've split so far.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
But we do have a new research center here that the Chickasaw Nation has opened, and that is going to be my next step into trying to unravel some of the, if I can just get the pieces together. And that's what I'm hoping.
Well, don't give up hope, Kenneth. And I know you're not.
No.
I know you're not, but
I have that calling. It's eating at me, and that's what is driving me.
That's what I was about to say. Let it drive you. Let it drive you, Kenneth. It's okay.
Okay. Well, I appreciate it, and I want to keep your show has enlightened me, and it just keeps that fire burning. So
okay.
I appreciate it.
All right, Kenneth. Thank you for your call.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, we appreciate that down in Chickasaw country, and we're going to go to break right now, and what was it like? Come on, you guys. What was it like when you were bringing in an outsider? Were you nervous? Not necessarily for them, but nervous for your own family, even nervous about how your tribal culture would be perceived by an outsider. All right, we're going to go to break. The number to call if you want to join in is 1-800-99-NATIVE. That's 1-800-996-2848. Following the earthquakes of 1811, false prophets appeared among the Cherokee as they struggled to revitalize their ancient religion amidst witchcraft, missionaries, and white intrusion of every kind. How did our tribal myths become fractured? I'm Harlan Macasato. Join us for our Book of the Month, The Myth Makers by J. Houston Emerson, on the next Native America Calling.
Santo, Betsenschlejine Lego, Beso Nihist Ingo, USDA Dark Epen Ye Beso Yin Kid Ego, 1981, do 1999 Ye Da, Beso at Ben Yehast Il December 27, 2011, Atu Il Kako, Beso Datlan Jen Doliel, Beso Be El Hadet Abets Ado, Ben Yehast Leko DB the D Il IndianFarmClass.com, Edo Dai Kujit Hodilne, 1-888-233-5506.
If you are a Native American who experienced discrimination from the USDA while trying to get a farm loan, you could get a payment of up to $50,000 or more. There will be meetings in locations around the country between July and December 2011 where you can get free legal help filing a claim. More details and a full schedule of meetings is available at IndianFarmClass.com or 1-888-233-5506. That's IndianFarmClass.com or 1-888-233-5506.
Welcome back to Native America Calling. I'm your host, Harlan Nicasito. I'd like to say hello to our listeners tuned in to KNBA in Anchorage, Alaska, KNNB in White River, Arizona, and KYNR in Toppenish, Washington. And you know what? I want to spend just a little bit here to say happy birthday to KYNR. Then, Yakima Nation Radio, KYNR, Yakima Nation Radio. They're celebrating their 11th anniversary. And want to say congratulations to all of you up there in Yakima Nation on behalf of Native America Calling, National Native News, Native Voice One. Thank you so much. And man, I bet you it doesn't seem like 11 years since that day you guys hit the air. But thank you so much for tuning in on KYNR. And KYNR, thank you so much for carrying our program. And happy birthday, KYNR. All right, we're talking about bringing in so-called outsiders from different cultures into our native families and into our tribal communities. And okay, so if you guys aren't going to call in to talk about your own relationships, let me ask you this. Are there any people out there who had a family member who brought in an outsider? All right, what was that like? Were you ready for it? How did you treat that person? All right, because should I say it? I mean, a lot of our Native family members want us to hook up, to marry, to have a relationship with other natives. I mean, that's just kind of how it is. All right? So when someone brings in an outsider, how did that make you feel? All right? Were you like, oh, I'm just glad she's in love. Oh, I'm just glad that he found someone finally that he gets along with, Let's share the story. All right. What's it like introducing someone to our native ways? I mean, the whole enchilada. Does it make it easier to be? Let me ask you this. Does it make it easier to be with a partner who's native, or is that just a cop-out? I mean, don't you want a challenge? All right. Native people marry outside of our race more than any other ethnic group in the country. All right. So how are we dealing with that? Give us a call, 1-800-99-NATIVE. That's 1-800-996-2848. We have Tiya Miles on the line with us in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and she is chair of the Department of Afro-American and African Studies, and she's also a professor of history, American culture, and Native American studies there at the University of Michigan. She's also the author of Ties That Bind, the story of an Afro-Cherokee family in slavery and freedom, and also The House on Diamond Hill, a Cherokee plantation story. Welcome back to Native America Calling, Tiya.
Thank you, Harlan.
Also with us, Joe Gahn, and he's an associate professor in the Department of Psychology there at the University of Michigan, and he's published articles and chapters concerning the ethno-psychological investigation of self, identity, personhood, and social relations in American Indian cultural contexts, and he is a member of the Grovon Nation from Fort Belknap, Montana. Welcome back, Joe.
Thanks, Harlan.
All right. Hey, Joe, do you think you have to take any, special steps to make sure that Tiya is included in all aspects of the Grovon culture, or are you just letting it happen naturally?
Our professional lives have led us to live out here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. So we get home as often as we can to my folks in Fort Belknap, but that isn't all that often sometimes. And so, part of I gather that you're interested in sort of the day-to-day challenges of having someone integrate into the community. But we've not really ever done that since the 8 months or so that we lived there at Fort Belknap before we started graduate school. And so in some respects, the kinds of issues you're raising are not ones that we could speak to as directly as maybe some of your call-in folks or other guests.
Well, we're getting ready to go there. We're getting ready to go to those phone callers. Tiya, let me ask you. Oh, go ahead, Joe. You weren't finished.
But I just wanted to say that, I think the way you're framing this is helpful in the sense that, of course, Native communities, like any community that's been under siege culturally, has an interest in trying to preserve community practices and ways through subsequent generations. And so I think you're pointing out that there are many Native people who would like to see their own kids marry other Native people. Although frequently that isn't even from the same community.
Right.
So even then you could talk about the cultural differences and whether people are accepting across, Navajos and Hopis or any other groups that have also, issues historically between them. But I think because you're pointing out also that so many Native people marry outside of our ethno-racial status, that it's got by now to be pretty common for Native families to have to adjust their expectations around having and welcoming what you're calling outsiders. So I wonder how anomalous it really is and how difficult it ends up being when people who are relationally oriented to begin with and who are used throughout history to adopting, to accepting, to making relatives and making kin out of all sorts of people who were technically outsiders. I don't know how different it really is today in this day and age.
I think Tiya put it well that, that we are very accepting people. And when we see someone who we love in a relationship that's healthy, I mean, what more could we ask for, really? And, okay, Tiya, let me ask you one more question, and then we're going to go to the phone lines. And that is, in the time that you've spent with the Grovon people, Joe's family, what do you think is the essence of tribal culture, and at what point did you say, "Oh, I get it"?
I would say that I think the core has to do with family relationship and generosity, care, and concern for the family as it expands from the mother and the child all the way out to extended kin. I mean, one thing that I was first impressed by was all the relatives I was meeting who were somehow, they were Joe's sisters and brothers, but they were really his cousins, or, he treated them like, they were his mom, but they were really his aunts. And just trying to get an understanding of the breadth of kinship and the importance of kinship has been really important for me and has also shaped the way that I have experienced motherhood.
In what way?
Well, as Joe said, we have been very oriented toward our careers, and for a long time I was putting off motherhood so that I could advance my career. But whenever we'd go back to Fort Belknap, his mom or his aunt would kind of ask when we were going to have kids and why we didn't have kids yet. And in fact, it was in Montana that Joe and I made the decision that we were going to go ahead and have children before we came up for tenure in our positions, even though it was a risk to our careers, because it seemed to be so important to the concept of family that we do that. And then once I became a mother, I basically followed the practice of Joe's mom and of one of his sisters who I'm especially close to in terms of making a choice to nurse my children and to nurse them for an extended period. I would never have done that if I had not seen that happening in Joe's family, and that attention, that care, that time that was put into being with a child and keeping a child close and raising a child.
Okay. Let's go to the phone lines. Let's bring in Michael, who's in Tohatchee, New Mexico, listening on KGLP. You're on the air. Thanks for holding, Michael.
Good morning, Harlan. Good subject. Just a little comment here. being around the bush, yeah, I had hooked up with a non-native from Iowa, one of them farm girls. And when we went to Iowa to meet her family and relatives,
Michael, you never told me you were a traveling salesman.
and we went to Iowa to meet the family and stuff on her side. It was pretty interesting, but I kind of was sitting there with not much to say because I felt awkward. But then after a while, I broke the ice and just told them about. I told them, I said, well, I'm glad to see that you guys have survived and you learned how to grow things. You got corn, beans, hay, and everything, and you're doing well, And on the other hand, when I came back home to here in New Mexico on the Navajo Nation, I was uneasy with bringing her home too because a lot of the natives were kind of like standoffish at the time back in the mid-'70s and stuff. So when we got there, it was a culture clash with, again, on her side. But after a while, a day or two later, I was questioned about it and just throw some humor in there to them. I told them, I said, well, I found her, but we just tipped over that Wells Fargo wagon and I pulled her out. So here she is, But it didn't last, so about 6 years and stuff. But there was just that culture problem, of the Anglo side and then my side, and that seemed to be a pretty big issue back then. But it's not such a big thing nowadays, though.
Well, that's what I was wondering too. I was like, there probably was more tension back in the 70s than there is now. I remember, let's see, was probably the 80s. Was it the 80s? I remember I took a blonde to a 49.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Yeah, I think where on my part the clash so much is that being a part with protesting against the U.S. government, with the American Indian movement and all this other stuff, and I still hold on to a lot of those values too, And I think on my side I clash more with her than she did on, with me.
Okay,
And,
all right, Michael. Thanks for sharing. Gonna let you go. We're going to go to Joseph, who's in Window Rock, Arizona, listening on KUYI. You're on the air, Joseph.
Hi, how you doing?
All right.
I'm an Anglo guy. I'm married to a Hopi woman. We've been married for, don't let her know that I don't know, 35 years. And I come from a monocultural, monoracial family. I'm a white guy from Kansas. But we just went back to New Orleans for Thanksgiving with my sisters. And I noticed that there were Anglos there. There's a couple of Mexicans. There's a half-black, half-white girl. And the thing for us, my family anyway, as an outsider, is somebody who's not a member of the family. If you're a member of the family, then you're an insider. And my experience at Hopi going to Thanksgiving is I've always been accepted. There's a lot of joking about they're having a traditional Thanksgiving with a real-life pilgrim there. But as you know, Hopis are funny people. They like to joke.
They don't make you put on a hat or anything, do they?
No, they don't make you put on the hat. But I've thought about wearing it sometimes. And when we go back to my family for Thanksgiving, there's jokes about, well, gee, we're having an extra traditional Thanksgiving. We've got Indians here. So, my wife and I were just talking. We were saying, in a family dinner like that at a Thanksgiving time, that, an outsider is somebody who's not a member of the family. If you're a member of the family, it doesn't matter who you are. You're a member of the family.
That's right.
And I think with, with my family, my father's one of 10 children. We have real close family ties. My wife has a big family and a real extended family with the clan and everything. And so I've always been accepted by her family, and she's always been pretty much accepted by mine.
Wow. Okay. All right. That's what I wanted to hear. Brian.
All right. Thanks.
Let's go to Brian. Let's go to Brian, who's in Albuquerque, New Mexico, listening on KUNM. You're on the air, Brian.
Hey, so I've got I'm a white guy, and I've got a kind of interesting story about my wife is Native, and when I first met her, her family sort of, her family's run by her grandparents' generation, and her grandparents' generation is from the 40s and 50s, And they kind of came up in a time when I don't think that it was something as much to be proud of back then. It was sort of more of an ethnic minority issue that they went through, so they kind of downplayed their Native status.
Mm-hmm.
So when I met her and I started dating her, I've been really active in the Native American communities as much as I can. I have some. I'm from Montana, and have a lot of connections in the Pine Ridge Res and Crow Res, and I talk about it a lot. And I noticed a lot of the sort of similarities in their culture, and I openly would talk about it with them. And in the course of the past 2 years, they started talking about their Native histories. Her grandfather talks about his time on with his tribe as a child that he never spoke about. My wife never heard him talk about it once till sort of I came into the picture, and I think it's part of that sort of opening up across cultures that has allowed them to feel that it's not something to sort of hide. And where their grandkids, like my wife's brothers and sisters, used to make jokes about drunk Indians, now they sort of are starting to identify as Native culture. So I think that, 30, 40 years ago, where people sort of, I think there was a time when Native peoples were made to feel ashamed about their culture. And nowadays, where that tide is absolutely shifting 180 degrees in the opposite direction, the relationship that I've been able to have with people that are 2 generations older than me has shown them how much more accepting people are today than they used to be. And they've been able to feel more comfortable expressing who they are.
That's a good point. Okay, Brian, thanks for your call.
Thanks.
Joe, any comment on that?
Well, I think it just goes to show that things are in motion. I mean, so there are moments in history when ethno-racial status and what it means in broader society and to people who occupy those statuses means one thing, and then over time it can shift to mean something a little different. I don't know if there's always revolutionary changes in America, but there are certainly evolutionary ones. And civil rights, if there wasn't ever revolutionary change, it's probably civil rights and the Indian rights movement and so on. So I think that part of what you're dealing with today is, while I don't doubt there are some people who have narratives of the sort you're kind of pulling for, I think either they're or don't want to talk personally about that on the radio. There are plenty of stories, though, that don't fit that template. And, the world has shifted in a way to where I think there's a lot more multiracial stuff happening and more cross-cultural contact, and it might have something to do with the historical moment we're in now as to how we approach these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I look at just my my own family, and my nieces and nephews, and there's a lot of interracial marriage, and we just have to be accepting. I mean, I do, and I think, because I don't know, I consider myself a full blood. I always say, well, I'm part white, but I can't prove it, but. I think there's something to that. I think maybe back in the day we were, sort of kept away from the rest of society, and we accepted that. We embraced it, actually. But nowadays, I mean, there's just too much interracial relationships going on, and so I don't know how you could not embrace it anymore. I mean, Tiya. Within your own family, are you the only one that sort of has married an outsider, or is it changing within your own family over the generations?
Well, at this point, I'm the only person, but there have been long-term relationships between people in my family and white people,
Mm-hmm.
and each of those new relationships was something that had to be adjusted to on the part of the family. But I do have to say that I think that race is a critical issue here. I mean, all
Right.
families have different experiences. Of course, all tribal nations have different experiences. But I think that the racial status of the person marrying in, can make a difference. And sometimes being a white person marrying in is more accepted. But I found that being a black person marrying in has created sort of a point of connection for me with some of Joe's relatives who are really strongly into their Native identities,
Mm-hmm.
because they see it as a link, a bridge, across groups of people who have been, colonized or oppressed or enslaved. In my own family, the long-term relationships with white people have been viewed as a little bit different because, of course, that historical relationship has been very difficult. Things have been changing over time. There are many more black-white intimate relationships that are positive, but we can't overturn history. So those relationships, I think, were actually more difficult in my family than my relationship with Joe. Once my family got used to the idea that he was, in fact, Native, and that was different than being white.
And that he wasn't white.
That's right. Once they got that, he got a lot of points, and it was viewed, kind of quite differently because of a sense of similarity.
I would never think that. I don't know. I guess I would never think that I would, be in a relationship and then for a person's family to think that I'm, white. Mm-hmm. I don't know. That's just weird, huh?
Well, it goes back to Joe's point about skin color privilege.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That when you're African American, I think you are very, very aware that dark skin is stigmatized. And any group that, as a whole generally has lighter skin, has privilege in this country. So the categorization can sometimes fall into this black-white category, even though we know that the spectrum is much more complicated.
All right, I'm going to go back to the phone lines. Let's bring in Michelle, who's in northern New Jersey, listening on Native Voice One. You're on the air.
Hey, how are you, Harlan?
Good.
And Tiya and Joe. I just want to say, hey, Tiya, we know each other, and I met you and Joe at Dartmouth. Ages ago. It's me stalking you.
Great that you called.
I just wanted to call and say hello to you both. I've been listening to the show, and it's great to hear your story from this perspective. And you've kind of touched on it a little bit as you've been talking, but I'm wondering if some of the anxiety that some Native people feel about, marrying out has to do with the way that Native identity has been racialized over the centuries.
Yeah, I think so. And I think this is an aspect that we haven't talked about yet regarding Native and Black intermarriages in particular.
Mm-hmm.
That Native people, especially in the South, have faced the challenge of being categorized by the U.S. government as people of color, as racial minorities, in a way that does not fit their political standing or their histories. And they've been lumped in with African Americans. So I think the reaction to that can be to want to draw away from African Americans and to mark a really clear, bold line between Native people and blacks, just to emphasize that Native people are indigenous, sovereign people and not like any other racial minority. I think that has caused concern and distance.
Right, and I think I kind of am more sensitive to that, being on the East Coast, and, there's such a different history to a lot of the nations here. Like you just said, it's people are mixed with Black people and Native people here, and that's caused some trouble on the East Coast. So I was just wondering if some of that anxiety hasn't been passed kind of from nation to nation, with blood quantum and all those kind of issues.
Well, I agree with you. The anxiety, I think, might be shared to a certain extent, but you make a great point. That in the West, it's kind of different. It's not the case that most Gros-Ventres have histories of intermarriage, and there's a lot of African ancestry in the tribe. In fact, there's a very small minority of African ancestry at Fort Belknap. So that means that people can be pretty clear that Gros-Ventres are, quote, authentically Native people. But when you move to the East Coast, just as you said, when you look at the Southeast and when there's been more of a history of intermarriage, and there have been questions raised about authenticity of Native people there, it can be worrying for members of those tribes. And that can lead to more of a concern about intermarriage with blacks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you for answering the question, and you guys take care, and it's a great show, and I've been listening to the show for a long time, so thank you too, Harlan.
All right, Michelle, thank you for calling. Thank you for tuning in on Native Voice One, and let's take another call. Well, actually, Joseph, let me get your thoughts on just that last comment about the racialization.
Yeah, so she brings up the issue of blood quantum, of course, which is a vestige of our colonial history in which we could have the danger of disappearing as Native people, according to most tribal membership criteria, if we intermarry heavily. And, I think the thing to recognize, though, is that blood quantum is part and parcel of a racial ideology that was foisted upon us and stands in really distinctive contrast to our older traditions of adopting and incorporating and even capturing people to make them kin for the purposes of a long-term survival. So there's a sense in which the blood quantum mindset pretends that there's this boundary of racial or genetic purity that can't be polluted by outsiders. But that is not only not ours, not traditional, or not native, it actually is destructive to our ability to imagine futures wherein people, like we always have, are going to be marrying other people outside of our own tribal group.
Mm-hmm.
So
but
the blood quantum fuels this, but I think that there's different ways to think about this.
But I mean, when you think about trying to hold on to tradition, culture, and heritage, I mean, because Joe, there are some pueblos here in New Mexico who do not allow non-natives, outsiders, to live in the pueblo, even if they're married to a tribal member. I mean, it's just like you talk about polluted. It's like what do you think about that? Like closed societies in this day and age in the 21st century. I mean, is it a matter of culture, or do you think that that's outdated?
So I don't know enough about the
I
logic of those kinds of decisions in those particular communities.
Mm-hmm.
But what I would say is that in general,
mm-hmm.
In that part of the country in particular had Spanish mixing with from back before we even have memory from many communities these days. So I think there's ways in which maybe these are reactions or responses to particular kinds of histories of colonization, or maybe there are some legitimate grounds for trying to police better who lives in the community and who doesn't. But it does strike me as being out of keeping with a certain form of progressive racial politics and a way of thinking about who peoples are and how they meet and how they come to live together that, in fact, provides perhaps a more hopeful view for what the future can be.
Okay. All right. With that said, Joe Gahn, thank you so much for being our guest today here on Native America Calling.
My pleasure.
Yep, it's good to have you. And Tiya, thank you so much for being with us on today's program. We appreciate all your input and your comments. And I just wanted, I'm looking for the book here. That there's two books, Tiya, Ties That Bind, the story of an Afro-Cherokee family in slavery and freedom, and also The House on Diamond Hill, a Cherokee plantation story. And can people find those on Amazon?
Yes, they can.
Okay. All right. Tiya Miles, thank you so much for joining us today here on Native America Calling. And also, you know what? I want to just ask all the listeners out there to go to our website, all right, and please take a short online survey because we did a series on energy resource topics that you've heard in the past year or so. And the survey link, all you got to do is go to nativeamericacalling.com. You can also go to our NAC Facebook page, but we'd really like to get your feedback. The survey should only take a few minutes of your time, and it's completely anonymous. So check it out, nativeamericacalling.com. Right there on the top is a link. I'm Harlan Nicasito. Thanks for tuning in. We'll be back tomorrow with our Book of the Month.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization located in Anchorage, Alaska. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the Annenberg Foundation, the McCune Charitable Foundation, and the Ford Foundation. Music is provided by Brent Michael Davids. Visit us at nativeamericacalling.com.
Native Voice One, the Native American radio service.